Brilliant. Welcome, everyone. I can see that some of you are still joining the session, so I'm going to leave a couple of seconds before everyone joins in. Perfect. Okay. I would like to welcome all of you to the second webinar of the UCD Rights Education Network. On behalf of the coordinators of the network, we are incredibly excited about today's webinar. We will focus on the power of narratives for human rights education. And the purpose for us on having this conversation was to think together, to think in a collective way about the educational possibilities of personal narratives, about the opportunities of incorporating the lived experiences of individuals as well as communities for the promotion and protection of human rights. Focusing on narratives allows us to think about human rights in a different way, to recognize the multiple perspectives, the multiple stories, and to engage differently in their complexity. Bringing stories of individuals, of communities at the center of human rights education provides us with an invaluable resource, an invaluable source to explore the causes and consequences of human rights abuses, but also think of ways in which we can move forward, in which we can build together a present and a future in which everyone's human rights are respected. So for this discussion, we are honored to have Mary Robinson and Caitriona Palmer with us, who among many other things, are experts in storytelling and harnessing the power of narratives to advance human rights. We are incredibly honored. Thank you so much for joining us. And we will be talking with them about two fantastic books. The first one, Climate Justice, and An Affair with My Mother. Climate Justice, a brilliant collection of the lived experiences of vulnerable people around the world who are currently witnessing and suffering the consequences of climate change. And An Affair with My Mother, the first memoir by an Irish adoptee detailing her experience in seeking to reunite with her natural mother. Before we start and before doing the housekeeping, I also want to welcome two very important guests with us today, Liam and Mary, Caitriona's Palmer parents. We are so delighted to have you here as our guests of honor. And just a brief housekeeping issues. The chat is open for all the members of the network to interact, to make comments. We, as always, like you to interact as much as possible in the webinars. But for the questions, if you want to raise any questions to our panelists, we ask you to use only the Q&A section, because that's the one we're going to be monitoring. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Suzanne, who will be talking with our guests today.
Thanks very much, Gabby. Great introduction. And also just to say, I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with all the members of the network, but in particular to welcome these two wonderful women who have so kindly agreed to give their time to talk to us today about the power of narrative in human rights education. So I'm just going to get the conversation going. Obviously, Mary and Caitriona, you know each other very well, having collaborated on the book Climate Justice with each other. And since we're here to talk about the power of narrative and storytelling in human rights education, I thought we could start perhaps with your story. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the book Climate Justice came about and how you came to meet each other.
Well, I think I have to start because that's part of the beginnings. And it was quite accidental. In January 2016, Nick and myself were in New York, and we invited Lynn Franklin, the agent for my memoir, Everybody Matters, to come for a drink because she told us she was going to retire. And we also included George Gibson, who had been the editor of the US edition published by Bloomsbury of Everybody Matters. And we had a nice conversation. And then George asked me about my work on climate justice because he was interested. And I said, well, you know, I do get frustrated because we're not communicating it well. You know, I think we need to use stories. And he said, well, Mary, if you write a storytelling book about climate change, I'll publish it. And then Lynn said, and I'll retire for everything else, but I won't retire. I'll work on that. And that's how it really started. And we laughed, but I think there was enough seriousness there. And of course, we followed up, and I was so pleased to have Lynn as agent, and I discovered she had somebody else on her books as well. And George, for a long time, was also a helpful editor of the text for both of us.
Excellent. And Caitriona, how did you come? You were the other person then, yeah?
So my part of the story begins in 2013 when I took a train from Washington, DC to New York to attend the premiere of a documentary about adoption. And after the premiere, there was a panel discussion, and a wonderful woman named Lynn Franklin was one of the panelists, and she was speaking very eloquently about the pain of losing her son to adoption many decades before. And I tend to be very shy and I never ask questions in these forums, but that day I plucked up the courage and I raised my hand and asked a question of Lynn. And after the conversation, Lynn came down to me to chat, and we were talking about all sorts of things, and Ireland came up, and Lynn mentioned that she was a literary agent and that one of her clients was Mary Robinson. And then I took the courage to tell Lynn that as an adopted person, it's very common to have celebrity birth parent fantasies, and that for a long time, Mary was my fantasy celebrity birth mother. So Lynn laughed and we became friends after that. And a few years later, I began writing my own book, and Lynn, as a natural mother, was very supportive and very kind. And the very week that my book was being published back home in Ireland, I flew home for a book tour, and it just so happened that Lynn and Mary were in discussions about trying to find a writer to help Mary tell her stories, and Lynn thought of me. So I met Mary that week and we hit it off, got on tremendously, and it was really obvious and evident to me that Mary had a brilliant idea for a book, and that she knew intimately the stories at hand, and that given my own writing history and my own previous background in human rights, that it would be a wonderful collaboration. And so here we are.
I certainly didn't interview anyone else, no one else at all. We hit it off from the beginning.
It was absolutely a match made in heaven, and it's incredible the way the two stories, you both gravitated so well towards each other for this excellent book. And I think the power of the book really comes from the stories that you relate from about people in all walks of life, and how they've all been affected by climate change, and how they've each turned themselves into very influential activists, both locally and indeed some globally. And so there's really a thread or commonality to all these stories. So I was going to ask you about how important do you think it is to find common ground in people's stories, and how does that help in educating about human rights?
Well, I think my first experience was how powerful it is if you can get the right voices at the table. This was on the conference on climate. When I went to my first conference in Copenhagen in 2009, I was shocked at how male, frankly, how technical, how scientific it was. No references to gender or human rights or even development particularly. And so the following year in Cancun, I helped with others to form a network. We called it the Troika Plus of women leaders on gender and climate. And that was because we had 3 women chairing the COPs, Connie Hedegaard in Copenhagen, Trisha Espinosa in Cancun, and the following year it'll be Mighty Mashaban in Durban. And those 3 women were on the platform with me. And the idea came up of forming this group, a network of women leaders on gender and climate. And we did do a lot, and I can go into that if necessary, but after making some progress, particularly on a gender action plan, the other thing that this group of women leaders did was recognize they were the heads of delegations. They were ministers of environment or whatever, foreign affairs in some cases, and also heads of the UN agencies. And they could determine who would be in their delegation. And when we got people like Constance O'Kellett in the Irish delegation, and Hindu as a delegate, which she was already arranging for herself and others, the powerful voices, they really made a huge, telling impact, because we got away from the idea of everybody guarding their own sentence and their own clause that they so felt was so important for obscure reasons, into the reality of what climate was doing. And these were the experts on climate. And I'm really a great believer in the importance of having those voices at the table, as much now and leading up to COP26 in Glasgow as ever.
And Caitriona?
Yeah, and just on that last note, I mean, Mary has been such an extraordinary advocate for grassroots women and for people who had no voice in the climate discussions. And she has used her platform and her kindness and her voice to literally give these women and men a seat at the table. But I think it's really important to find common ground in people's stories, especially during a time like this, and especially in a country like this where I'm sitting, where there is such division and suspicion of the other. And I think for us, for Mary and I setting out to write this book, there was a common thread very evident across all of the stories, and that was dignity, the inherent dignity of each of the people that we hoped to profile. And it was very important for us to bring their humanity to the forefront and to make their humanity present. And even
Caitriona,
though
you brought that out very well. I mean, I was saying it, but you somehow wove it very well in how you helped to write up those stories.
But it was so easy, Mary, because as you know, each of those people were just, so extraordinary. I felt really humbled to be in their presence. It was really a gift. And that's how I view this book and this collaboration, for me to be able to meet these people and to listen to their stories.
And Caitriona, I think the phrase dignity comes very much to mind as well in relation to your own memoir, An Affair with My Mother, the way in which you deal with every aspect of your story and treating everyone in it with such dignity. I just wanted to ask you, in relation to climate justice, that particular book, was there any particular story that resonated with either of you? I suppose it's invidious to ask that question because so many of them are so fascinating and so interesting. But can you pick out one? If you had to pick out one, maybe both of you, which would you choose?
Why don't you go first this time, Caitriona?
Does it have to be one? It's very hard to choose one story, but I'm very fond of the story about Constance O'Kellet, who is a small farmer from eastern Uganda. I think I'm very fond of the story because I spent a lot of time with Constance when Mary and I traveled to Marrakesh for the COP in 2016. And Constance is she is dignity personified. She's an amazing woman, and a woman who suffered terribly in 2007 when her village was ravaged by a flash flood. And Constance is a woman, she's a fourth generation farmer, so she has innate understanding of nature and of the world around her. And she had noticed for years beforehand that the seasons were off, that things were not right, that the rainy seasons came early and that the drought in the dry season lasted far longer. So when her village was literally washed away in the aftermath, Constance decided to take it upon herself to galvanize the women in her community and to get everyone on board to try and fix it. She had no idea at that time that this was an effect of climate change. She had never heard of global warming, but her just day by day, small steps, she was able to get the community to plant more trees, to get seeds, to really turn the community around. And that was a really powerful story.
I do agree with Caitriona about the dignity of Constance. I remember when we had that hearing with Archbishop Tutu, and I was teasing the farmers, the 5 African farmers, that they, farmers always complain about the weather. And I remember so clearly that Constance stood up, and she's a very tall woman. And I learned afterwards, I stand up when I have something important to say. And she stood up and she looked at me firmly and she said, "This is outside our experience." And I'll never forget it. It really was very compelling. But all the stories, as Caitriona said, have their impact on us, and we love them all. But I really like Hindu's story, particularly as a young girl. And I just want to read a little bit from the book to give you and that's why I wanted Caitriona to go first, so I could read this. She would be in the city to go to school, and it was very unusual. Her father allowed her to go to school, but she would go to her grandmother, and under her grandmother's direction, I'm reading now, Hindu followed the same rites of passage as the other nomadic girls in the community, milking the cows and performing chores. But on her return to school in the late summer, she would become the target of school bullies who mocked her for her roots. In quotes, "The other girls did not want to sit next to me because I was from a pastoralist community. They taunted me, saying that I smelt of sour milk. I felt discriminated against." Tired of the abuse, Hindu decided to take matters into her own hands and started an organization at the school for bullied kids. She was 12 years old. In quotes, "It was an association to protect the rights of those other marginalized kids," Hindu said, "and my own." Hindu is still in her 30s. She was chair of the platform for Indigenous peoples that I worked closely with at various COPs, and we worked on. She has addressed the Security Council of the UN. She has been to Davos. I don't know what she hasn't done. She of course, we've become enormous friends. But and of course, English isn't her first language. French is her first foreign language. So to come from a pastoralist community in Chad, to be milking your cows with your grandmother, bullied at school, and then go on to being a very, very well-known voice now in the climate world. I mean, everybody knows Hindu. They don't remember her second name, Umaru Ibrahim, but they know who she is and they listen to her voice.
That's a fantastic story, and it really.
It's all about education.
Talk about education and the power of education, and now she herself being such an incredible voice on human rights. And I suppose as well, what strikes me is that that's really a story as well, isn't it, about somebody being empowered or empowering themselves and helping to empower others then with the work that she does.
And standing up to bullies, which is something I like a lot.
Which resonates with so many people, especially children, but also in adulthood as well. And Caitriona, it brings me to actually the theme of empowerment and storytelling and trying to encourage people to tell their stories. I suppose that was an aspect of your own book, An Affair with My Mother, and absolutely, may I say, utterly beautiful and respectful and deeply sensitive book. And obviously it was a very difficult book for you to write. And the theme, again, I suppose I get from it the importance of encouraging and empowering people to actually come forward and tell their stories. And you were so courageous in doing that. Could you share with us the reasons that motivated you to write the book? And I'm also very interested in hearing about your experience in terms of how it has perhaps helped other people to come forward and tell their stories.
Certainly, I mean, it was an accidental book. I never expected to write the memoir. As Nuala O'Fuelan famously said many years ago, memoir leaves blood on the tracks. And I was very aware of that, and I'm a very private person, so I still can't believe I wrote that book. I mean, for those in the audience who don't know, I was adopted in 1972, born to a so-called unmarried mother, and I spent 2 days with my mother before I was sent to Temple Hill Baby Home, where I spent 6 weeks before Liam and Mary, my wonderful parents, came to pick me up. I reunited with Sarah, my birth mother, in 1999. She was overjoyed to meet me again. It was a wonderful reunion, but there was a condition to our relationship moving forward, in that Sarah asked that we keep our relationship a secret, because in the intervening 26 years, she had never told a single person about my existence. So we embarked upon what I refer to as an affair. We met in secret in hotels across Dublin. I never called her on her cell phone. I knew her address, but I never ever went near her house. It was a furtive, clandestine affair. And time passed. I married, I had a child, I had another child, and the secret grew heavier and heavier. And I became deeply curious about Sarah's need to keep this secret. There was so much social change happening in Ireland. Ireland was becoming more and more secular, and there was a real disconnect. I couldn't understand why. So the journalist in me began to investigate. Initially, I tried to do a documentary about natural mothers in Ireland, in secret natural mothers, to understand why they were, like Mary, like Sarah, unable to come out with the secret. But I couldn't get anyone to go on air. These women were terrified. They would speak to me on the telephone, but they refused to go on air. So that's when I decided, you know what, let me write this story. Let me investigate the facts of my own life and Sarah's life, and put the pieces of the puzzle together. So I did so with Sarah's permission. She was very, very brave to allow me to write the story. And it was published in 2016. But the strange thing about the book, when I was writing it, I had three readers in mind. I had Sarah, and then I had my parents, Liam and Mary. And I never imagined that anyone would ever actually read the book other than them. So I was astonished after publication, when it came out, that I began to be inundated with emails and social media messages and letters from other people like Sarah and like me, secret birth mothers and secret adoptees, who were saying to me, your story has validated my own. I too have been saying I'm having an affair with my mother. I too have a child that I gave up for adoption and that I've never told anyone about. So it was an amazing gift for me. And again, I'm very fortunate to hold these stories in my possession, these precious stories of pain and loss and grief, and of the legacy of Ireland's terrible treatment of the so-called unmarried mother and her illegitimate child. You know, our state has so much to answer for in terms of how these women and children were treated and how they continue to be treated. That I, as a 48-year-old woman, still have no access to my birth records or early life files, as do so many others. So it was a tremendous gift, and I'm very grateful to all of those who wrote to me.
Absolutely. I'm very conscious, obviously, Caitriona, that we are, you know, I'm asking you about your book and you're speaking about it at a time when many people who did actually have the courage and were able to come forward to give their stories to the Mother and Baby Home Commission on Investigation have expressed disappointment that their stories have been effectively ignored. And also, of course, the recent news that audio recordings and transcripts given to the Commission have actually been deleted. I was wondering, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very disappointed in the report, as are many other survivors. You know, to give a little background, the report was authorized in 2015 after the discovery of the hundreds of remains of children at the Bon Secours Mother and Baby Home in Tuam. There were many years of investigations, and just last month the report came out. The report covers 18 institutions, but the Adoption Rights Alliance have identified 170 more institutions and agencies that were dealing with the separation of women and children during that period. And in my opinion, the report is full of inaccuracies and contradictions. On the very first page, it notes that women were not forced into these institutions, despite the testimony of women to that effect. It says that there's no direct evidence of forced adoption, even though my own birth mother would say the opposite. But the treatment of the survivors, in my view, those who again gave their precious testimony, their evidence, was so uncarefully treated. You know, 550 people had the courage to go forward and to give evidence about the trauma they endured. The evidence was recorded, no transcript was made, and now we just discover in the previous weeks that those recordings were deleted.
Mm-hmm.
So to destroy the stories, the only testimony, the lived evidence of these survivors is really appalling. And in my opinion, it heaps abuse upon abuse.
Many groups now, of course, are calling for a national archive to be established that would provide education and truth-telling. And I suppose I want to ask you, Caitriona, specifically in relation to the mother and baby homes and the Magdalene laundries as well, how important is memorialization and archiving in terms of educating about human rights? And also, Mary, of course, from your vast experience generally in the field of human rights, maybe you also have a view on the importance of archives and memorializing.
Well, I fully support the establishment of a full, independent national archive of records to allow survivors of institutions and adopted people to access their records. I think before that, there should be legislation passed to allow people like myself, adopted people, access to their birth records and their early life files. And I would love to see the establishment of a site of conscience, perhaps, in Ireland, somewhere where members of the public can access these records, but most particularly survivors, where they can have full unfettered access to their records, including those who were incarcerated in institutions like Magdalene laundries, the industrial schools, and the mother and baby homes. And as Mary, and as our book shows, the holding and the careful holding of testimony is paramount. We need to honor people's stories. And academics and students and researchers need access. We cannot paint a picture of a historical event without full access to records.
Mary, were you?
Well, we started early in this conversation talking about the importance of dignity. And I can't help feeling there's not much dignity when 550 people have the courage to come forward and tell their very personal, very painful stories. There's no transcript, and then the audio version is destroyed. It's really a terrible loss, basically. I had a kind of parallel experience to Caitriona's in a much more minor way, in that I was asked by Maura O'D in 1971, I think it was, to become president of Cherish, an organization she had formed of single mothers. And I remember saying to her, look, Maura, I'm far too young to be president of anything. And she said, this effing isn't about you. And so I became president. I remember that Bishop Casey was the patron. Now we know why. Later we learned why he might be patron of a body called Cherish. But I found that extraordinarily brave of Maura O'D and her colleagues. And then in 1973, we won social welfare for single mothers. She went on Gay Byrne's Late Late Show as a fallen, sinful woman. And there were horrific responses to that and so on. So, it's another version of the story. And I think, given what has happened in Ireland, particularly to women and children, we need somewhere to encapsulate and remind ourselves of the dignity and worth of each of these people and have some memorial way of doing it. It seems to me to be something that should be done. I also recall the number of times during our work together when Caitriona would say to me, Mary, I cannot cope with the number of people who are getting in touch with me. And I kept kind of advising her, look, Caitriona, don't take all this on yourself. Pass it back to the authorities. And, it was an interesting, but it was clearly quite a burden of sheer opening up the tap, if you like, of people wanting to tell their story.
Absolutely. And you responded to every single person, basically, Caitriona.
Yeah, I did. I did. And I really, Mary, I so appreciated that because, I didn't want to, this was all very personal for me, but you were such a friend to me during that time. And, that was so kind of you because it was a burden. It was a gift and it was a burden. And I often thought of Brené Brown, who's this academic here in the United States, who's done a lot of work on vulnerability and received a lot of attention. And she always says that shame needs 3 ingredients: silence, secrecy, and judgment to flourish. But it also, in order to eradicate shame, it needs truth telling and storytelling. And I always thought of that, and thought of that in the context of our book, Mary, but also in those people who are writing to me. So by speaking out loud and by sharing our stories, we eradicate shame and we open up a light. So I often think that those who wrote to me, and again, they're not writing to me because I have done something, they're just writing to me because they see validation in my story. And I think that's so important in rights education, that there is validation and that we listen to one another and that we take care with each other's stories.
And it's very striking, I suppose. It's lovely to hear the two of you in that exchange, your personal friendship, but a lot of what you've both said as well has spoken to the sense in which women in particular, there's something very valuable about the stories in the book, in particular Climate Justice. A lot of them are stories told by women. And I just wanted to turn to you as well to speak about your podcast, Mary, which you do with the comedian Maeve Higgins. And I think it's one of the unique selling points, the great sense of humor and the exchange between the two of you. And I thought maybe in that spirit, just to sort of channel my Maeve Higgins as I ask a couple of questions here. I was just going to ask you, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, I'll try and get rid of now of my little hat trick, having difficulty doing so. Just maybe you could tell us a little bit about the podcast, your experience of podcasting. I know that you had said once when you were at UCD that you found that you hadn't even heard of what a podcast was when you were first asked to join the podcast with Maeve. But now Mothers of Invention has just finished its 3rd season, and it's incredibly gets rave reviews for the education, the refreshing way that it goes about educating people about climate change and solutions and so on. So could you just tell us a little bit about your experience of the podcast? And in particular, I know the tagline is climate change is a man-made problem with a feminist solution. But I know that the sort of emphasis in the last season was on young people and connecting with young people. So I was just going to ask you in particular, why is it important to really listen to the voices of young people as you've been doing on the podcast?
Well, first of all, I've discovered I have something else common ground with Caitriona, because I too wanted to make a documentary to communicate better the seriousness of climate. So I was referred by a friend of mine to 2 people who are great advisors on documentaries, Doc Society, my friends now Jess Search and BD Finzi. And we spent an evening in their kitchen, first of all, and then a whole day the following day, in which I told them passionately I felt a documentary would really help to tell the story. And at the end of it, they said, Mary, it takes a long time to make a documentary, and you're not the best person to do it. Why don't you do a podcast? And then I asked the question, what's a podcast? And they said, leave it with us. And they came back, several months later. I'd actually forgotten that I'd asked them. Time had passed, and they rang me and said, now come to London, we're going to fix you up. And so they said, we've arranged for 2 people to be interviewed by you as possible co-hosts. And the first of these was Maeve Higgins. And after 15 minutes, they canceled the other. And they said, no, this actually works. And, what we were trying to do in the first 2 series, I would say particularly, was to get the voices of women telling their story who would not normally be heard. I think in the 3rd one, we were even more targeted towards, in particular, women and young women who were focused on building resilience in their community in a particular way, having very compelling stories that otherwise wouldn't be heard. And there was a sort of more edgy theme, I thought, running through the 3rd series. And we've had 4 men now, I think it's 4 men The last one being, and I'm dropping a name here, Bernie Saunders.
Oh, wow.
That wasn't part of strictly Mothers of Invention, though it's now included in the platforms.
Did he wear his mittens? Did he wear his mittens?
No, that was before the mittens. But he was very good. And actually, what was particularly good in the conversation between us was how keen we both were on the intergenerational conversation and listening to young people. And, what's really very important now about the intergenerational conversation is that it has completely changed. In my day, it was a conversation where the young listened to the elder with respect and took on board that wisdom. Now, young people are so smart, they're so digitally connected, they've got so many ideas, they're open to a whole world. It's a much, much more equal conversation. And that's what's so exciting. And young people need access to the possibilities of having their voice heard.
That's fascinating as well when you think about education in particular, and how education actually, and human rights education, is very focused on moving away from the banking model where the teacher, wags the fingers and gives the information. I think we're all educators here. The power of young people and young voices in a classroom to educate us as well as educators is so important. And I think that's a real turn in education anyway. That's my view. Caitriona, do you have views, I think, on
oh, by the way, sorry, if I could just, I wanted to explain the byline of the...
Oh, yes, please do.
Lest there's any misunderstanding. It is, it's challenging. It says that climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. But I always explain, Maeve would never bother explaining. She said, no, Mary, I won't explain. Well, anyway, I would explain that man-made is generic, that we've all contributed, and that a feminist solution, meaning a problem-solving, collaborative, not hierarchical, working together solution. A feminist solution is a solution for both men and women. And the more men who adopt a feminist approach, the better.
Brilliant, yeah. Caitriona?
Well, no, I wanted to plug Mary's podcast because it's so optimistic and it's hopeful, and climate change is not a laughing matter, but Mary and Maeve together are hysterical. It's really, really funny. If it doesn't work out in global leadership, Mary, there's definitely a job for you in comedy with Maeve.
Yeah, I've been told that, and I wouldn't touch it.
But it's marvelous. Yeah, it's a marvelous way of communicating the important information, really, isn't it?
Well, actually, what impressed me and what led me to, when I heard that I was going to be interviewing a possible comedian to be a co-host, I did a bit of, really? And then I thought to myself, in my time in the United States, I spent 8 years with my Realizing Rights NGO. And that's when I first came to understand the importance of addressing climate change in developing countries in particular. I realized that most of the young people I was talking to got all their information from the Daily Show and Saturday late night show, etc. They didn't believe the daytime television anymore. They literally got it from the humor, but also the truth to power.
Yes, and the medium. Yeah, absolutely. So looking to the future now, I suppose, for both of you, you're both involved, obviously, still in a huge way in relation to climate change. Caitriona, you're also involved in raising awareness about ongoing issues, human rights issues, specifically in relation to the mother and baby homes. You mentioned access to records in particular. I was just wondering, are there any other human rights stories that are in the pipeline for you at the moment that you hope to tell in the future?
Well, my day-to-day work, being a writer is a terrible way to make a living. So I have to pay the bills in other ways. And I have a consulting, very lucky to have a consulting job at the World Bank where I write about climate. And that's very interesting to me because I'm writing about it from a development perspective and from a private sector development perspective. And again, at the World Bank, I try and put beneficiaries first. So my job there is to tell stories about those that who are receiving World Bank investment funds. My interest as a writer has always been to focus on those who've fallen through the cracks, to tell stories about people who don't have a voice. I think that was very evident in my memoir and in my work with Mary. So I'm very focused on just finding those kind of stories. You know, I've found what I love. You know, I began my career in human rights. I worked with Physicians for Human Rights in Bosnia. And Mary doesn't remember this, but I had this awful, awful experience in Sarajevo when I was green and young, where I had to give a presentation in front of Mary when she was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I blushed and blustered and made a complete mess of it. So there is some serendipity for me now, you know, decades later, to redeem myself somehow. But I want to keep writing about those people who lack a voice. And I feel very fortunate to be able to do that.
To help to bring people out of the shadows, I suppose, as well.
Exactly.
I think we all, Caitriona, have our Mary Robinson story. The last time I met Mary, I had the pleasure and privilege of introducing her at another UCD event. And I went on so long about it that afterwards, even she had to acknowledge that I needed to stop a little bit sooner. But I told her back, listen, that's your fault. It's your CV I was presenting. Anyway, at that very event, Mary, I believe my colleague, Andrew Jackson, gave you a memorable badge afterwards, Angry Grannies for Climate Change. You were just telling us that just before we came on air. So you don't mind being called an angry granny, is that right? I also noticed, just to twin that with your book, that you reference in the book Climate Justice, when you're speaking about Archbishop Desmond Tutu, you mentioned that he speaks about climate justice as a narrative of hope. So putting those two themes together, I was going to ask you, what is your hope as an angry granny for the future in a post-COVID world?
Actually, Andrew did better than just give me a badge at the time. He sent me quite a few badges, Angry Grannies for Climate Justice. And I handed them around to a few people, you know, after the Angry Grannies came from the big march in 2014 in New York. So a year before Paris, which was December 2015, there was a huge march, 500,000 people or something came out. And I was there with Gru Brundtland for the elders. And everybody wanted to join us because we were the elders and we were holding a plaque and everybody was gathering around, anybody, you know, who learned, etc. And then out of a side road, we didn't move at all because we were too bunched together. I mean, we would slowly shuffle along and talk. And then out of a side road came this group of women holding a banner saying Angry Grannies. And I said, that's the one I want to go behind. So that became the beginning of the Angry Grannies. And yes, I continue. I mean, I have 7 grandchildren now, and the youngest was born in September. You know, think,
congratulations.
You know, what age she'll be in 2050. The others will be in their 30s and 40s. I'm not even sure. I haven't worked it out whether she'll be 30. You know, it's kind of, you know, you have to think very deeply about what we are doing, how we're not in sync with nature, etc. So I'm completely all full on every day. I wake up every morning. What more can I do? I hope to do another series of the Mothers of Invention. I'm aware that this is a really important year. We're about to have shortly a conference on climate and development that the United Kingdom and Italy will be organizing for poorer developing countries. Then we have the conference that Biden has promised on Earth Day, the 22nd of April. And that was to have been for big countries, major economies, but now he's been persuaded, and I've been a little bit part of the persuading, that he should include developing countries. And then we have the Convention on Biodiversity, we have the COP26, we have this year of gender equality. And if I might just link all of this to COVID, and maybe this is how I can kind of put it all together. COVID has been a mirror which has exacerbated all of the inequalities here in Ireland, but also around the world, in a very raw, very visible way. And it has shown the intersectionality between those inequalities. And I'm hoping that as we go forward, that we will link Black Lives Matter with the Children for Climate Justice, with the Me Too campaign, with all of the discriminations, with the adoptive survivors wanting justice, with all of it in a way, and, you know, sort of and that we will not want to build back better, even though that is, I think, the language of the UN and certainly language Biden has used. No, we don't want to build back at all. We want to build forward with equality and fairness and security and justice and education. COVID has thrown us all out of our comfort zone. It has devastated the world, and it's a tiny virus we can't even see. So we're much more vulnerable as a human species than we thought we were. Let's get smart, and let's have a sort of humanity that speaks to our humanity, and not the inequalities and the divisiveness, but actually we are all human beings with human rights, civil and political, but also economic, social, and cultural. Why can't we actually want to re-engage with nature, live in a much better way, and be very happy doing it? That's my hope, that we can actually somehow change that whole narrative. It'll take some doing, but I think we have to do it, and we will start to do it if instead of build back, we're saying build forward. We have to align ourselves anyway, coming out of COVID, with the climate crisis, which is just as bad or worse, because we're losing time during the COVID period because we're not active enough. But things are happening, and they are hopeful. I'm more hopeful now than I was in January 2020 because of COVID. It seems a strange thing to say. I wouldn't wish COVID on anyone, but it has changed things. It has broken the model, and now we can start again and get a better model.
Yes, it's held up a mirror for ourselves, as you say, and very, very inspiring and very encouraging words. I don't want to hog the show now. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Marnie Rowley, and she has going to give us some of the questions that are coming in from the rest of the people in the network and our audience. Thank you both very much for answering my questions, though. Really enjoyed it.
Okay, thanks, Suzanne.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks a million, Caitriona and Mary. So we've lots of questions. The first one I might ask here, I suppose, is a little bit related to what you were just saying, Mary, about intersectionality. So Gregory, who describes himself as an adoptee rights activist in the US, is asking, how do you avoid, or maybe you can't, the idea of a hierarchy of rights? So he's an adoptee rights activist, but he's also terribly concerned about climate change. And between the two, he feels that climate change wins because it affects every person on the planet, some far more than others. So I'm just wondering if you have any comments in relation to that.
Well, I think it's a very good question. Thank you, Gregory. But I wouldn't use the words priority so much as getting out of our silos, that we can relate to the other in every context. And if we can somehow see this intersectionality, it was something I learned actually in Durban in 2001, when I was Secretary General of the World Conference Against Racism. I hadn't been aware of the feminist theology before that, the feminist education on intersectionality. And it was a real eye-opener to me. And interestingly, it's worth thinking about. One of the big, in the end, the Durban Conference Against Racism succeeded. And it was the third conference, and we actually got our declaration and program for action. That's sometimes forgotten because 3 days later we had the terrible attacks at 9/11. But I want to come back to one of the, interestingly, I'd forgotten this, one of the main focuses of attention at lunchtime was victims of racism telling their stories. Isn't that interesting? It was compelling. And I've actually advised that we try and do that during COP26, that we try and have victims of the injustices of climate change, the 5 different layers of injustice of climate change, telling their stories to help us to move on.
Thanks, Mary. Caitriona, do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, Gregory. And I think the hierarchy of rights in terms of adoption legislation is very interesting and something that I've come up against a lot. And people ask me whose right is greater, my right to be known or my natural mother's right to keep me a secret. And that's really the crux of the secrecy legacy in Ireland, and one that I battle with. And there's no answer to that. Neither right cancels out the other. So certainly that's something that is very prevalent in Ireland, and something that I think in terms of decent human rights focused legislation on adoption can be resolved by allowing adoptees access to their records, but also honoring the rights of natural parents.
Thanks, Caitriona. And moving on to this piece about storytelling, Irla, one of our colleagues in UCD, is asking, do the speakers think it would be a good idea to have storytelling as part of school education around the world to enable us all to communicate in ways that would facilitate working together to overcome our global challenges like climate change or human rights, etc. So storytelling within, I suppose, the school curriculum. Do you have any thoughts, either of you, Caitriona?
I mean, I would love for that to happen in a constructed, deliberate way. I mean, as a child, I loved stories. My own 3 children love stories. I'm proud of my kids who are reading, human rights focused narratives. For anyone listening, my 13-year-old daughter just read an amazing book called The Girl Who Smiled Beads by Clementine Wamaria, about one girl's, loss in the Rwandan genocide and then her journey to America. And that's a book I was just saying to my husband recently that needs to be on a school curriculum. Middle school children here need to be reading that book. I mean, I'm proud, Mary, Climate Justice, our book is being taught in universities. At Boston College, it's being taught there quite vigorously in the School of Philosophy, I believe. And I think it's really, really important for people. We talked earlier about a common thread and commonality. People, each of us, I think, desire and crave connection. And as a reader and as a writer, I've found connection in human stories. So for children learning and reading, I think that type of connection, but one with a human rights focus, would be so amazing.
Yeah, I would just add, I think, good teachers actually do a lot of that. They tell stories themselves, and they kind of keep the interest by, and even now in virtual days, I know that, certainly my 16-year-old granddaughter told me, they're asked to watch films and, rank them, analyze them. And, that's good, so storytelling is such an essential part of human rights and human dignity.
Thanks. And I suppose linking in with continue on the theme of school, Carmel is asking, she says, from my experience, those who do not traditionally have an influential voice are often seen or dismissed as lacking credibility. So she's thinking in particular about children, and especially vulnerable children. And so she's just wondering if you've experienced this in your work, and how do you kind of address that, where they, are seen to lack credibility or their voice isn't really heard.
Well, for what it's worth, I remember, I traveled a lot around the country as president to activities locally, which I loved. And I said at the end, that one of my abiding memories is the smell of wet paint, because there were so many places that, were excited that the president would come. But I would often seek out a 13-year-old at the back of the room, or somebody who was clearly shy, because I was very shy myself growing up, very shy. I had to force myself to debate, and I had to, at school, and then in college, and then I became auditor of the Law Society, and I would go completely blank sometimes in the early days. So I know what shyness is, and I would try and, so I'm very alert to the fact that people who have an awful lot, if they could get it out, need to be encouraged to say it. I can't remember the bungling that Caitriona did in Bosnia on that occasion, but I would have encouraged her, I'm sure, if I'd been aware that she was bricking it.
Caitriona, do you have any thoughts in relation to that, just around giving children, I suppose, a voice?
Yeah, no, I mean, I have 3 children, and that's my greatest role, I think, as a mother, is to give each of them agency and, to help them use their voice. And I'm very proud that both of my daughters, when interrupted by either their father or their brother at the dinner table, are able to say, excuse me, I was talking. Yeah.
Yes.
No, but I do, certainly the theme in climate justice in our book, obviously these are not children, but these were people without a voice. So I think broadening that ability for people to be able to tell their stories, and to do that from as early an age as possible is really, really important.
And if I may, it's very compelling now that you have such smart young people and very young people speaking out so well. People reference Greta Thunberg, but there are thousands of very bright, and often they're young women who are playing a role now and speaking out. And that must be very encouraging for many young girls in particular, who tend to be a little bit slower to take the floor or make their voice heard or be confident enough to project. So I think, there still will be those who need somebody to see that they need that encouragement. But I think it's back again to the difference now that young people are so smart, so connected, and have so much to say about the world they want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a few more questions actually in relation to young people. So sticking with that theme. So Katie's saying, how do young people who wish to tackle the major issues of our time? So she mentions racial justice, climate crisis, and direct provision. How do they actually begin fighting these fights when those who hold the power to enact change, such as government bodies, seem so distant from those on the ground? So I guess we've talked a little bit about the importance of, school and the education sphere, but is there any other ways, do you think, in which young people can start to do that when those in power seem so distant from them often?
If I may just start on this, because I'm sure Caitriona will want to come in. I think it's important to, look out for organizations that are involved. I mean, often it's a collective voice of an organization on a particular issue, and they're more open to young people and actually like to have energetic young people joining. So that's one way. I also think, and this isn't part of the question, but it's going to be part of my answer, it's time for people like me to step back more and give more space to young people. So I'm trying to do that now. I'm invited a lot on panels. I always ask, is it gender balanced? Is there a young person? At least one young person. And when we have the panel discussion, I try, insofar as I can, to say, let the young voice first and let us follow. And in our podcast, for example, in our last session of this current third series, we passed over to Shea Bastida and another, actually a funny voice too, which was great, to be Maeve. And it was completely them, with a very young climate activist from Samoa, I remember, and I listened with great pleasure to the whole thing being taken over by these young. That needs to happen more.
Thanks, Mary. Any thoughts, Caitriona?
I would agree with that, and I've watched Mary involve and include young people to an extraordinary extent. And I do think her podcast and other podcasts on these issues, on rights issues, are one way for young people to get involved. And these new mediums have been very, very influential.
Thanks, Caitriona. So Edwina is also asking specifically to you, Mary, just about what advice you'd give to the next generation about the right to freedom of expression in this age of social media, particularly. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
It's a very big question if you think it through, with all this fake news and all this bullying and all of the issues that are part of a world that I didn't know so much about. I mean, when I took the stand as a young senator to introduce a bill on family planning and got hate mail, it was what we now call snail mail. It was through the post, and it was very painful. What it's like to be bullied now on intensive targeted social media, or what it's like to have all this fake news and worries about whether what you're being told is credible, etc. I mean, even in relation to vaccines, there's so much rubbish out there that's undermining or trying to undermine. So it is difficult, and so we need the power and truth of good education to withstand all of that. And I think we do need more protection against what I would call the dark side of social media. And being an elder, I'm not an expert on that.
Thanks, Mary. So we have another question from Rose, who's asking, so she's saying climate change is a problem which people often feel helpless to do something about. However, given that we're all responsible to different degrees and in different ways for contributing to climate change, how do you think we can encourage individuals to take responsibility for those contributions and the harm they cause for people and for communities around the world? So how to take that responsibility? How do we encourage that?
You want to go on that, Caitriona?
Yeah, well, one of the chapters in the book profiles Natalie Isaac, an amazing Australian woman who created a movement called the 1 Million Women movement. She started out very small, and she basically had that exact question, you know, how do I, as an individual, lower my own carbon household footprint? We profiled her in the book. I mean, there are very simple steps that we can each take to help lower emissions. And I think there's a lot of criticism of that. How can one person change the world or change the calamity that we're facing with global warming? But it can be done. Our mutual colleague, Mary Tara Shine, just wrote an amazing book, a practical book, which I have somewhere here.
Change by degrees.
Change by degrees, yeah, to, you know, literally taking the house room by room and focusing on appliances or ways to lower the household. So I personally am very inspired by these stories. I try to do it myself. Mary made fun of me. Sometimes I would cycle to meet her in Washington on my bike and offer her a lift. She never took me up on it.
Well, just building on what Caitriona was saying, I think, you know, I often speak to audiences, especially in answer to a question like that. Yes, there are at least 3 things we can all do. We all should take the climate crisis more seriously in our lives and make it personal. And you know you've made it personal if you're doing something now that you weren't doing yesterday. You know, you just make a further commitment. Secondly, we must get angry again, angry granny, angry about those who are not doing enough, and use our voice and our vote and join organizations and get active, because it's as serious as that. And thirdly, most important of all, we have to imagine this world that we need to be hurrying towards, a much healthier world, a world of new jobs, clean energy, living with nature, cities being much more pleasant to live in, and so on and so on. We must, you know, tell ourselves these stories more. And collective behavior, we know now, is very powerful. It's the only thing protecting us from the virus until we get the vaccine rollout. So don't underestimate behavioral change, which we are going to need. Particularly, we waste 1/3 of the food in the world. We waste 1/3 of the food in the world. And yet we have, you know, famine and starvation around the world. And we have, even in rich countries like the United States, food banks and queues for food. You know, the thing is a bit askew. But I just want to make the point, all of this is relevant, but it's not going to change the real systemic problem that we have, that we're not on course for a safe world. And that needs government policies. It needs governments to commit at the COP in Glasgow in November to have a commitment to be zero carbon, zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and where I'll be in 2030 and where I'll be in 2025. We need corporations to do it. We need investment companies to do it. And that then, with the bottom up of what communities can do, will get us there. But we need that systemic change in order to be on course for a safe world.
Thanks very much, Mary. So I'm going to take 2 more questions and then we're going to, I think, wrap up. So my colleague in UCD, Marie, is asking, she's thinking about how to influence change. And would you have any comments, Mary, about how to influence permanent civil service? So she's just mentioning that there's changes of administration, but the civil servants are more constant, and yet they're very often hard to reach. So when you want to promote some idea about change, it can be hard to reach them. And do you have any thoughts on how you might go about that, or how we can, I suppose, influence change more?
Well, I think that, you know, the responsibility for the sort of policy change is with the elected representatives who form a government. And I'm happy that we have actually changed quite a lot in relation to climate. We now have relatively good climate policies. We're part of the European Union, which has also stepped up quite a lot. And I think by and large, civil servants will take their cue from that and respond to that. You know, I think I certainly, let's put it this way, the civil servants I come across most, I think I'm right to call them civil servants, are the ambassadors of Ireland in different countries. And I cannot tell you my admiration both for them and for their staff. And I mean around the world, I mean in developing countries. Ireland is very lucky in the people who serve in our embassies around the world in relation to how they seek, particularly in the Irish aid countries, but also in the UN. And we're now back on the Security Council. It's taken very seriously. And I know how hard people work at that. So it's kind of not quite the question, because the question is more lower down. I was a member of Dublin City Council for a number of years and found it very frustrating because we couldn't get anything done because the city manager had all the power. So I understand that too. You know, I do think that if the policy is right, then those implementing it by and large will do their best.
Thanks, Mary. So just a last question, I guess in both of the books, the stories that were gathered were, you know, emotional and very sensitive. And I guess I'm just, you know, given that we're talking here today about the power of human rights, of narratives in human rights work, how do we ensure that when we use narrative human rights work, that we're doing it in an ethical way and in a way that, you know, doesn't cause any additional harm to the people whose stories are being gathered? And Caitriona?
I think it was very important, and I do think it was Caitriona who, you know, made it clear that this is what we should do. We went back to each of the storytellers. She took on the job of doing that, but she kind of, in conversation with me, said, Mary, I think we should get the approval of all of the people we're writing about for exactly that reason. And I agreed, but it was her idea, not mine. So Caitriona, do you want to take that?
Yeah, no, I think inclusivity is key. This is a collaboration. When you're telling a person's story, you have that story in your care, and that person needs to be in the lead. So, you know, we were very careful with the book to be inclusive and to ensure that each person that we profiled understood fully and saw what we wrote. That's actually not very common in publishing sometimes. And I think approaching it with a human rights framework is really, really important too. And you've seen that with the mother and baby homes investigation. The report did not have a human rights framework and did not follow protocols to keep the testimony, to preserve it and to give people a voice. So I do think compassion and inclusivity and taking care of people's stories is the only approach.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Caitriona, and thank you, Mary. I don't know if my fellow colleagues have any further questions you want to ask Dee or Gabby or Suzanne. If not, we'll turn to Dee for some closing remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, Maren. Mary and Caitriona, gur míle maith agam Bert, for just a really warm and inspiring, thought-provoking reflection on the power of narrative, not just in terms of, I think, human rights education, but actually in terms of empowering humanity. Caitriona, you referenced Brené Brown today, but also in your book, and the importance of the power of vulnerability and the need to take emotional risks when telling stories. And I think today you both really exemplified the power of being vulnerable in telling stories. So thank you both for that. I've picked out a couple of themes that jumped out at me when I was listening to you today. The first, Mary, I loved your phrase, humanity that speaks to humanity. And I think that's so powerful, and that came across very strongly today. Bringing humanity to stories and bringing forward female voice into perhaps more technical conversations, and that impact that that's having in terms of climate change and changing the world The second theme that jumped out at me was this powerful thread around dignity and the inherent dignity that you want to bring to the stories. And that's been very much foregrounded in both of your books. And I think you've really touched powerfully today on the impact of mistreating stories and the destructive impact of that, not only on individuals, but actually on our society as well. And the deep impact that has and the emotions that evokes for us all. And I just love this idea of taking care of story and the compassion and treating stories with compassion, which also very much came through. A third theme that came through for me, very difficult to say third theme as an Irish person, isn't it? I always struggle with that. Was empowering others through stories and bringing forward marginalized voices. And I really love this idea of the power of young people's voice, something I'm quite passionate about myself. And the leadership that they demonstrate in changing lives. And, you know, Mary, I loved when you said this idea of stepping back to bring forward. I mean, that's such a powerful metaphor for what we should all be doing as adults in our societies, actually stepping back and allowing that voice to flourish and bring us all forward as a society, and the power of those intergenerational conversations as well. Really, this idea of coming together actually to solve our problems and not just think we have the answers, because we know one thing we don't. The final, I suppose, theme that came out for me was this idea around the responsibility for the future. And again, Mary, this idea of building forward. I absolutely love that. I think that's absolutely brilliant. And addressing inequalities by breaking down silos. And again, a very strong theme. And very much for me, what came across at the heart of the conversation, I hope you don't mind me saying this, is this idea around questioning and challenging what's happening actually within our societies, in our institutions and across our systems, and the power of story in addressing that. So there were some of my reflections on the conversation today, and I know other people would have a lot more to contribute to that. I thought I'd finish with two quotes, if you don't mind, from your books. The first I've taken from your book, Mary and Caitriona, Climate Justice. And in that you say, we need a different way of living together, and it has to start now. It requires us to begin to sow the seeds of human solidarity and develop a global spirit of compassion. And Caitriona, in your book, you wrote, writing this book has been my attempt to create order out of chaos, to etch a coherent narrative out of sorrow and pain. At the same time, I have always felt that there is a real sense in which this is not just my story, but the story of every other secret son or daughter. It's been a real privilege and an honor for us and the UCD Rights Education Network to have you here today. Thank you both so much for your time. You've been so generous. I'd like to thank the audience who joined us for the webinar. We're absolutely delighted to have you here today. If you want to find out more about the Rights Education Network, please email us at ren@ucd.ie. But on that note, I'd like to say Gura Míle Maith Agaibh and thank you so much.
Okay, Gura Míle Agaibh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.